The doctrine of the Trinity is a paradox, but it's what Christians have believed for a couple thousand years. And when Jesus made a comment in John 14:28 that the Father is greater than him, it really confuses a lot of people. Let's take a look at that verse. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, if you really loved me, you would be happy that I'm going to my Father who is greater than I am. Okay, so the question is, what's Jesus talking about here? In what sense is the Father greater than Jesus? Is Jesus admitting here that he's not fully God, that he's, sort of like God Jr. or something, but that the fullness of the deity doesn't dwell in Jesus? Because if this is what Jesus is saying, then the traditional doctrine of the Trinity is wrong. It's false. So let's dig into this. Okay, first we have to understand the doctrine of the Trinity. And here's the doctrine really in simple terms. God exists as one being in three persons. So there's a sense in which God is one, that's clear from the Bible, and what we call that is his being or his essence, his substance. God is one being, and he is three persons, okay? God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and God has always existed like this. Now, the reason this is so hard for us as human beings to understand is because we all exist as one being, one person, and yet God exists as one being, three persons. Super confusing, I understand that, but we have to start with this simple doctrine. That's what we take the doctrine of the Trinity to mean. God is one being, three persons. We are one being, one person. God's bigger than we are. God's better than we are. Deal with it. God is God. You're not. Okay, so let's talk about their different roles for a second, because this might help you to understand this. And we're getting to John 14. We'll get there. But when we say that they're distinct persons, what we mean by that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit have different roles. They have eternally had different roles. The way that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have always related to one another, even before the world began, there was a distinction in their roles. And the way that they function on earth, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there's a distinction in their roles. So even though there's not a distinction in their essence, in their being, that Jesus is fully God, that the Father is fully God, that the Holy Spirit is fully God, yet in some way, and certainly in terms of how they relate to us and even how they relate to one another, there is a distinction in their roles. So for example, we can't say that the Father went to the cross and died on the cross. We can say that the Son died on the cross because the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus went to the cross and died on the cross. That was Jesus's role. It was distinct from the Holy Spirit's role. It was distinct from the Father's role. So the role of the Son, one of the roles, was to die on the cross for us. The role of the Father wasn't to die on the cross. So can we say that God died on the cross? Yes, we can. Can we say that the Father died on the cross? No, we can't. We have to say that the Son of God, that Jesus died on the cross. That was Jesus's role. So there's a distinction in their roles, and yet somehow there's no distinction in their essence or their being or their substance. Okay, let's talk about the incarnation for a second. When we use this fancy theological word incarnation, we're talking about the moment in time when the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, when the second person of the Trinity added to his already divine nature a human nature. So he didn't change his divine nature. Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, didn't stop being God when he added flesh. He was already fully God, totally fully God. And at that moment in time, at the incarnation 2,000 years ago, he added flesh. He added a human nature to his already divine nature. And what he did then is he temporarily suspended some of his exercise of his attributes of God. This is what Philippians tells us. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Now notice what it says there. He gave up his divine privileges. Now what that means is that he temporarily suspended his ability. He voluntarily did this. He suspended, while he was on earth, his ability to exercise all of the full attributes of his God nature when he took on human nature. So for example, he wasn't everywhere all the time. So he wasn't omnipresent, which is an attribute of God. He wasn't omnipresent for that time that he was on earth. He suspended that divine privilege for a time while he came to the earth. This is what the author in Hebrews says in chapter 2. He says, what we do see is Jesus, who was given a position a little lower than the angels, and because he suffered death for us, he is now crowned with glory and honor. Now that phrase, a little lower than the angels, is talking about human nature. This is what humans are. Humans are a little lower than the angels. And in Hebrews 2, the author is telling us that Jesus subjected himself to this position while he was on earth. He didn't fully give up his God nature. He was still fully God, and at the same time, he was fully man. That's the doctrine of the Incarnation. He suspended temporarily some of his God attributes while he was on the earth. And now we're ready to tackle John 14:28. See, when Jesus said that the Father is greater than he wasn't talking about his divine attributes. He wasn't talking about his essential nature. He was talking about his self-imposed limitations on earth, which, by the way, were going to be lifted after he went to the cross and died on the cross and rose again and went to be with the Father back in heaven. And that's what he said later on when he continued his dissertation to his disciples in John 17 and verse 5. He said in his prayer to the Father, I brought glory to you here on earth by completing the work you gave me to do. Now, Father, bring me into the glory we shared before the world began. And the glory that Jesus is talking about there, that he shared with the Father before the world began, was the essential being and nature of God. And Jesus was saying, we're going to go back to the way it was before the Incarnation, before I limited myself and took on human flesh. That is what John 14:28 is all about.